Morrison's Mussolini moment and taxpayer-funded warmongers hide from scrutiny, coming up on today's show. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 19th of August 2022. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robbie Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show we're going to be discussing Morrison's multiple ministry takeover and implications for the future. And we'll talk about the small select group that are pushing us, Australia, putting us in the pathway of World War III, or at least a proxy war against China. Now, don't forget, if you like the show, hit the like button, subscribe and ring the notification bell, and share this as widely as you can on social media and so forth. Make a comment below, that always adds to the circulation of the video.
And Elisa, before we begin, just to remind people what we announced last week, that on the 7th of September, midday 7th of September, there will be a public forum in Parliament House on a postal bank, which will be addressed by a former New Zealand Cabinet Minister, Matt Robson. So we're building that as we speak to invite all the members of Parliament and staff and media and other interested stakeholders to come along and see a presentation on this. There'll be a lineup of politicians who'll speak in support of it. It's being hosted by the Licensed Post Office Group and the Executive Director, Angela Cramp, who's doing a lot of work towards it. So this will be a big, part of a big surge of getting support for this concept. Because, like I said, this is one that we can win. The best thing that the viewers who support this can do is take personal responsibility to stay in touch with your Member of Parliament. And if you can, get on the Parliament website and look up the senators from your state and start contacting them as well. Identify yourself as a constituent and say you want them to support this policy. You can tell them about this event coming up. We'll put out a public notice very soon, but you have those dates, midday on Wednesday the 7th of September in Parliament House. You want them to attend, or send their staff if they're too busy, but really encourage them to get engaged with this policy. They don't have to support it, but they need to understand it, because there's a bill that's going to be introduced into Parliament as soon as possible, and we need to make sure that this really becomes. What we've got to do is this should be a non-controversial policy, except if you're a banker, because it's a threat to you if you're a banker. But for the rest of the body politic, they should see, okay, here is a service that we can establish which will benefit Australia, right? And we need to build the support for that, make it bipartisan across the board. That'll come from you guys engaging with them.
Yeah, if you're sick of your local broken down infrastructure, get onto your councils. They should be pushing the MPs to do this as well, and any other local leaders. But moving on to the first topic for the day, Morrison's Mussolini moment. Now we're going to talk about the national leader who implemented the designs of extreme liberal economists who took over the leadership of numerous ministries, who hollowed out the public service and demolished the very institutions of government.
And his name was?
Benito Mussolini.
Benito Mussolini. This is fascinating that we'll go through the details, but the parallel, and we're not doing this as just a symbolic parallel. There's an actual parallel here, but in terms of the methodology, it's very similar. People really need to reflect on what we've seen, what we now know Scott Morrison was doing. There was a power grab underway. The remaining question is for whom? He wasn't doing it for himself.
Yeah.
Mussolini worked for bankers and corporations. Morrison, we'll talk about that anyway.
Yeah.
But let's go through the details.
Well, first of all, of course, Morrison, if people haven't heard, put himself into the ministries, took over the ministries, or co-ran the ministries of Health, Finance, Treasury, Home Affairs and Resources. So
well, you wouldn't say co-ran, because so he became a secret second minister in those portfolios. The only one who knew was Greg Hunt when he did that. And the excuse was the powers of the health minister under a pandemic are awesome, godlike, so you need someone to share that. So Greg Hunt knew. Then he went on and kept doing it, and the other ministers didn't know, or at least they say they didn't know.
Yeah, and of course, one of the experts in this area of cabinet government, Patrick Weller from Griffith University, as per the excuse you mentioned, that we needed to have the capability in case one of the ministers fell ill or wasn't capable of doing the job. He said, he basically called that BS using that language. And he said contingencies such as ministers falling sick would never have posed a problem and presented only minutes of immediate work. In other words, you just swear someone else in at that moment if it happens.
And they have, they have acting ministers all the time, Elisa.
That's right, when someone goes overseas.
Yeah, there's always an acting minister. What's the big deal?
So Morrison took advantage, this Griffith University professor said, of the leeway in democratic conventions, at the same time undermining the principles of cabinet government, such as the fact that the authority resides in the minister.
Yeah, a lot of laws are written in such a way that they say the minister may determine, the minister shall determine, etc., right? And so the person who's sworn in as the minister has that power under the law. Remember the discussion of the Biloela family, the Sri Lankan family that went back to Biloela. That was entirely at the discretion of Alex Hawke, the Minister for Immigration, who also has godlike powers, and who frankly didn't want to use his godlike powers to do something godly and help someone, right? Even though he's a professing born-again Christian. That's why you can't have two people that can say, no, I'm the minister, I'm going to do this. And if one of those is the Prime Minister, as in the case of the resources decision where he overruled Keith Pitt, if the Prime Minister is that second minister, of course he's going to overrule the First Minister. And, who's really running the show?
Now, Morrison, remember, not long before the election, his fellow Liberal Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells described Morrison as an autocrat and a bully who has no moral compass. And of course, we spent the last few years documenting his abusive role against the citizens of Australia, for instance, protecting the banks from the Royal Commission instead of protecting bank victims, his treatment of people that interfered with him protecting the banks, such as Christine Holgate, for instance.
Yep.
So we know that he had those kind of brutish tendencies.
Well, and that's where we're starting to get to the answer of the question, for whom was he doing this?
Yeah.
Right? Because it isn't just for his sake. He serves vested interests, right? And in our time engaging in Parliament, we've never seen someone quite like Morrison to shamelessly serve the banks. And that's why we use the example of the Royal Commission. And the Christine Holgate thing was just stunning. And I know one of the things that came out of that inquiry and everything we did last year to get the inquiry up is it emerged, sources, really well-informed sources, told me that back in 2018 when Christine Holgate was negotiating with the banks to get them to pay extra money for the bank at post service or else it wouldn't have survived. It was going to be shut down and she needed them to pay the extra money. She was really concerned what would happen if it got shut down because 1,500 communities around Australia would lose all banking services if that happened. So every couple of weeks she's calling the banks and she's saying to them, we need to do this deal. And Christine Holgate is a really, really lovely person, right? And so to her face, these bank executives, Shane Elliott, what's his name? Matt Common, etc., saying, yeah, Christine, yeah, we'll do the deal. Behind her back, they were calling Scott Morrison, the treasurer at the time, to whinge about her. Right? And this definitely would have contributed in Scott Morrison's mind to his animosity towards Christine Holgate, and that all came out on the day. Now, before we go on the details, I want the viewer to reflect on something, Elisa, because I think people are impressed at the way we turned around public opinion and what happened to Christine Holgate. Because at the time it was like, this fat cat executive is giving other fat cat executives gold watches. Who's going to defend that? And we knew something else was going on and we defended it. But at the time, no one else did, right? Even Anthony Albanese jumped on the bandwagon. Yeah, she's got to go, etc. Reflect now on what what we now know about Morrison's behaviour proves about him. He was a power-mad thug. We like his own Karen Andrew, the Home Affairs Minister who he stood in behind secretly, said he's got to resign from Parliament, right? And all of them sat there like cowards while he did that to Christine Holgate. And the Australian public, until we turned it around, shrugged and said, oh yeah, she's a fat cat executive. No. We now know a power-mad politician was running amok in our government, right? And we had a sense of it and took it on. And a lot of the people in the public would have, knew something was a bit awry about Scott Morrison, but think, oh, well, that's politics. No, it's not. And you've got to take it on and you've got to stand up to it. And, now it's all starting to come out in the wash.
And, his treatment of women played into a much bigger dynamic, along with a number of other dynamics about his attitude to the people, as opposed to subservience to the banks and bigger institutions that led to his political downfall.
I'm laughing because when you said his attitude to the people, think about this. This is the biggest paradox of this. This man has never had more power. We've never had a politician in Australia with more power than Scott Morrison had in the last 3 years. Never, ever, ever. More power in one person's hands. We've never had it. But it was in the hands of one person who took, no politician has ever taken less responsibility than Scott Morrison for using that power to help people. I don't hold a hose, mate. Yeah. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I'll wait 2 weeks before we do anything for Lismore, right?
It's not my job.
It's not my job, blah, blah, blah. What an absolute damn paradox. So he wasn't using it for the people. Who was he using it for?
Yeah.
And by the way, you can go around Facebook right now. He's on we might be able to put some of this up, producer. I'll talk to the guy behind the camera. No, he's going around Facebook right now. There's lots and lots of memes that Australians are putting up of putting Scott Morrison's photo in a scene of someone else doing a job, right? And Morrison is spending all night going around and making funny comments under those because he's making a joke about the whole thing.
Oh, God. Anyway,
okay.
What we want to make another point because, and this is important, how did we get here?
Yep.
The capability for Morrison to do what he did and not get any pushback at all, that didn't happen overnight. So we've been on a slippery slope over time where the institutions, even the laws themselves that allow the people to self-govern, in what a democracy is supposed to be, have been eroded over time. So we want to go through a number of things point by point. Firstly are constitutional questions. And I'll just mention that when asked about this, the Governor-General Hurley said that the appointments that Morrison made were made consistently with Section 64 of the Constitution, which says that ministers may be appointed from among the Queen's Ministers of State for the Commonwealth and hold office at the pleasure of the Governor-General. So that's a vague justification if I ever heard one. Yeah,
so the Governor-General is the executive. Morrison, as a minister, and the Prime Minister, yes, is part of that executive, but he's from the legislature, the Parliament that elects the Executive Council, right? But the difference in the two, our system of checks and balances, the legislature is supposed to check the power of the executive because they write the laws. The executive is supposed to be a balance against the power of the legislature. He's just been able to do everything he wants, right? And the Governor-General just rubber stamped it all. There's two specific things I'm sceptical about the Governor-General part in this though. He's claiming that there's no reflection on him that this was all secret, right? Well, he has a publication called the Gazette that he has to make announcements in, right? That's his responsibility. He didn't do it. Something really dodgy there. And the other one is he claims he didn't inform the palace. This is really hard to believe because Jenny Hocking is this constitutional expert who's done all these books about the Whitlam dismissal and dug into the archives, and what the archives have shown you, not just in the case of Sir John Kerr and Whitlam, but the previous archives of all the Governor-Generals. They show how closely the Governor-General of Australia keeps the palace informed of everything. And here we are in a the biggest national crisis for us since World War II. That's what it was regarded as. The Prime Minister is making extraordinary moves and he's not reporting back to the palace. I don't believe it for a second. We won't know for 30 years until those archives get released.
Yeah. Now, taking a step down from constitutional law, we've seen the erosion of legislative accountability, and we've written about this over the past couple of years, where you have the increasing incidence of what's called delegated legislation, where the legislation is not passed by the Parliament but is just declared by the Minister for that department or by the Governor-General, if in an extreme case that can happen. Now, mostly such legislation can be disallowed within 15 days by a vote of the Parliament. However, there's an increasing incidence of exemptions from disallowance where they put a clause in there saying this can't be disallowed because it's exempt.
And didn't this go up, like the use of this went up massively during the pandemic?
Yeah, so from a recent inquiry into this, which reported in February 2021, which was overseen by Labor Senator Kim Carr, reported that nearly half of all legislation is now delegated legislation. I mean, that's stunning. And about 20% of it was exempt from disallowance.
So what that means is the Minister or the Governor-General, it's in the legislation that the way that this law will work is the Minister gets to make all these decisions. And like you said, normally with delegated legislation, there's a disallowance process. So the Parliament can say, hang on, this decision the Minister's made, which has the effect of law, we don't like, we're going to overrule it. But they put in these laws, no, this is exempt, this is exempt, this is exempt. So think about this, an increasing use of this in the pandemic, making it undisallowable by Parliament. And the one man, the Prime Minister, has admitted that those are the departments he targeted to put himself in as a secret minister. So he would have those undisallowable delegated powers.
Now, and the other thing that this committee inquiry made clear was that in 1970 there were only 3 kinds of legislative instruments, but by the 1990s there were over 100. And this also includes things that they call regulations.
Yeah.
And we heard about this in the cash ban, where we wanted the legislation to be more clear, and if you push for that, they will say the people in charge of that legislation will come back and say, oh no, that's made clear in the regulation, which is an adjunct to the legislation, but it doesn't have the power of legislation.
And which the Minister can change. It's up to the Minister.
Oh, on his own bat, that's right. The other things that have also been used more and more recently is the deferring of sunset dates. So where a legislation has a sunset clause and it's meant to automatically expire at a certain date, they push it back. So that's been happening more and more often. And the other thing is so-called Henry VIII clauses, which enables delegated legislation, which is the legislation just passed by the Minister on his own bat. It allows that delegated legislation to make amendments to primary legislation. So that delegated legislation makes them then go back through the books and say, oh, we'll make these number of changes to the primary legislation, again without a vote. So this is quite extraordinary stuff. And one of the things noted in this inquiry on this matter was the link between growing socio-economic inequality and declining trust in government. But I'm going to come back to that later when we talk about the economic factor in this breakdown of the ability of the people to participate in governing. But now I want to talk about 3 interrelated things which bring Morrison into this picture. One is the consolidation and shake-up of government departments. The second is the construction of bureaucratic power blocks. And third is the destruction of the agencies of government, meaning public service, including the outsourcing of the public service and departmental staff being outsourced. And I want to refer to an article, and we'll put up an image of this, because this was a fairly prominent article at the time, and we've referred to it in the past because it's got a number of significant points in it, called Network of Influence. The Prime Minister has assembled a team to drain the swamp in his way. And interestingly enough, this was also written by Simon Benson, who put together this book.
Wrote the book that these revelations have come out of, yeah.
And who, we might add, sat on this knowledge for who knows how many months.
All right, editorial comment on that. Just consider that this is, so everyone knows this has been a massive story this week, the revelation that Scott Morrison had all these powers. So by any definition, it's a massive story. The journalists who broke it in a book, and they've known about it for more than a year, right? They sat on it until they could use it to sell their book. And I've seen experienced journalists saying, if I was their boss in the newsroom, I'd sack them, right? Come on, your job is supposed to be sniff out stories and break the news. It actually shows you how journalism has been corrupted in Australia. They're part of the cover-ups of these things. They're part of it's coming out now, but they do it in their way when it's convenient to them. Why is it the Prime Minister, they got it, how do they know? Scott Morrison told them a year ago. Why is it the Prime Minister of Australia told these journalists and didn't tell his own colleagues?
Yep.
Right? The role of the media, don't trust a word they say.
And listen to what Benson and his co-writer Jeff Chambers went through in this article, because it shows that Morrison had this agenda in mind. He planned to restructure government departments and rebuild the entire structures of governance around his networks of friends and collaborators. The article says, this is from the 6th of December 2019. Scott Morrison is building a new power block around his leadership, dismantling the old Canberra club with a network of friends, confidants, bureaucrats and trusted allies tasked with reshaping Australia's political, cultural and policy direction. The shake-up marks a generational shift in the power base of the mandarins and political class who have ruled over economic, environmental and social policy, national security and the role of business in government decision-making. And he talks about the hard-nosed clique of reformers that Morrison put together, together with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet Head Phil Gaetjens, Home Affairs Secretary Michael Pizzullo, Treasury Secretary Stephen Kennedy and Cabinet Secretary Andrew Shearer, who Morrison had brought back from Washington for the job. And there were others that were involved in that, including cabinet members, political advisors, private secretaries, diplomats, intelligence chiefs, business community, and no doubt the media. When you look at the role that people like Benson has played as having the ear of the Prime Minister, but they axed the Morrison government when he came in. Axed 4 departments, sacked department heads, established new super departments like Home Affairs. They purged the public service. Morrison moved to reshape Australia's national security architecture, led by Mike Pizzullo, who claimed not to know about these ministry decisions, which I'd find hard to believe.
He's a pretty sinister character, frankly.
Yep. And they did the same with finance. That was another big target. And remember at the time, during the pandemic too, there was all this discussion about how the banks had to have minute-to-minute information on bank accounts because of these dangers and so forth. So there was a lot of shifting around that going on as well, which brings me to discussing the other point in this matter of the institutions by which people can participate in government having been eroded that brought us to this point. And that's the neoliberal destruction of the economy, because when you look at what we've documented in our Australian Alert Service in recent years, and you see from, for example, the point of the Wallace Commission, which
98.
And that eliminated a number of crucial government regulations and controls over the economy. It took government out of control over banking, for instance, and then numerous other royal commissions, commissions of audit, budget reviews, changes to the Reserve Bank mandate, which basically put the market and the private sector in control of the economy, which in parentheses is something Mussolini is well known for, and also led in large part to the disillusionment, as I mentioned earlier, of the population, because when people don't have the basic economic basis to live day to day, they're less likely to be engaged in the process of governing and in politics, and they become very enraged at government. So you tend to get a dynamic where, again, as in Mussolini's time, you get a big protest movement, which is not so much engaged in policy ideas as in just pure rage, which becomes hard to control and which then can lead to fascist crackdowns.
Well, that's why we reported this, our initial impressions of what this scandal was at the time on the lead of the alert service this week in that way, Elisa, because what neoliberal, like a really simple way to express what neoliberalism means is the government shouldn't be involved in the economy, right? And the impulse behind it wasn't an honest one. It was government is getting in the way of the control of the economy by big business, by big banks. So they demonise government and they suck the general population into things like, I remember, in the 80s, it's the lazy council lollipop guy who's paid all this money just to hold a sign up all day, or the Telstra. The telecom worker, oh, what a cushy job, the telecom, all these government jobs, saying, I'm working really hard, look what these guys, they get paid for doing nothing. And so in the public's mind, they're being brought into this demonisation of government. And under that helped create the pretext where the people with an agenda moved in and smashed government. And what they did is dismantle the ability of the government to serve us. If the issue was what's the government doing, it's up to the people to make sure it's doing the right thing. They cynically harness the people's opposition to destroy the ability of the government to serve us. And then, at first, people aren't seeing the consequences, but 30 years later, the consequences are absolutely everywhere. So what happens in those circumstances where you then, I'll give you one. I was having a discussion with someone on this yesterday. To just take one sociological phenomenon, which is the destruction of manufacturing in Australia. Back in the day, when the single biggest sector of the Australian economy was manufacturing, more workers than any other, and agriculture is the same, but workers who are involved in productive industries, they are participating in an economic system where they're making a contribution every day. They're involved in processes which are scientific. Production processes are scientific. They see how what they're doing is contributing to the way the economy and the nation works, right? And then over the course of a few decades, it's taken away from everybody. And you're either unemployed or you have a job in services. And your services are not scientific at all. In fact, they become less scientific. The more you can spruik yourself and make all sorts of claims about yourself, the more likely you're going to have a services job, right? So people get disconnected from the process of the economy. Then what you were saying earlier, they feel increasingly powerless. They're at the mercy of decisions made by politicians instead of feeling themselves that they're in control of their own destiny, right? They know that the decisions made by politicians are absolutely awesome, like in terms of terrifying. They can have far-reaching consequences. The powerlessness makes them feel enraged. The politicians get that, and what do? Well, what decent politicians would do is say, which is the whole reason our party exists, we must change the system back to serve the people. What these thugs do is say, our power comes first. We must preserve our power at all costs. Therefore, we must grab more and more and more of it to do that, right? We must take control of everything to do that, not to serve the people. If you ever want to placate the people, deliver for them. But no. If we, the government, is going to keep serving the banks and delivering for them so they can keep making their massive profits, etc., we need more power. And this seems to be exactly what was driving Morrison in this massive power grab. He's distrusting his own ministers that they're going to do the job right. He thinks, I must have this power because these people are going to stuff it up and make trouble for me, right? I'm going to be this secret presence in all these things to make it happen. And it is Mussolini all over again with the same motive because he represented the interests of corporations.
Yeah. Now, when Mussolini first came into Parliament, was elected into Parliament, he was very quickly ushered into a coalition with the governing Liberal Party, the conservative Italian Liberal Party. And he continued to enjoy the support of the Liberal Party even once he was, after the March on Rome, was declared dictator.
Before you go on, just for the historical record, which is now completely established, you can look it up online, the way he came to power included being on the payroll, an Italian Prime Minister on the payroll of British intelligence, MI5. They paid him, he was their agent, and they made sure he came to power because there was a larger geopolitical agenda here. But go on.
But yeah, once he became the leader in his own right, as I said, he still enjoyed the support of the Liberal Party, and in fact a number of key Liberal economists, very well-known Italian Liberal economists who followed British economic policy models, continued to write his policies for a very long time, and he appointed himself to at least 10 different ministries to head those ministries at different times. He played a key role, as we've seen from what I went just through, in terms of consolidating and eliminating ministries, concentrating power, sacking countless numbers of public services, outsourcing government capabilities, privatising, of course, everything including infrastructure, abolishing public institutions, all of the ways that the people could interface legitimately with government. And at a certain point, because this was, again, an evolution, it wasn't just full fascism straight away, but full fascism came into effect, really was induced by the gravity of the economic crisis. And so what I would say is that, we didn't have Morrison actually use these powers. He was ousted. We still have the basic abilities to, have government of and by the for the people in existence right now. But we are heading for a grave and harsh economic crisis in which these things are great threats. And so,
in the context of that, if he was still in power now, we wouldn't know any of this.
No doubt.
He would have these powers, we wouldn't know them. And if there was the combination of economic crisis and war, he would be able to move like that and use them, right, for whatever purpose that he and his backers wanted to use them for. And so now we know about them. We have to make sure that we are saying, how do you actually address the problem?
And solve the economic crisis, which is where our public banking policies are crucial.
So let's end on that, because it's just quickly, what are we doing by pushing a postal bank? We're saying the government must get back involved in the economy at the top end, where the real power is, the money power. What banks have, the power banks have, is the real power. They want an exclusive monopoly over it, so they can just use it to loot us to death. If the government gets its own bank back, it can show the public how a bank like the Commonwealth Bank did, how a bank can be used for the common good. And that's how you bring back government as an entity that people can trust again, right? And control again. Government of, by and for the people. That's what that means. It's no mistake that the US president who said those words you should do a history lesson one day. There was a handful of American presidents that were real champions of national banking, the government being involved in banking. Lincoln was one of the greatest of them. And that's what it means. And our postal bank is a way, it's not just a quaint little idea, it's a way we can do that. And on that note, Elisa, I forgot to mention something earlier, if I can just, on the postal bank campaign. We put out a release this week about cashless bank branches. And we put out a call. This is very important. If you know about cashless bank branches in your area, we need you to notify us for this reason. If it's cashless, it's not a bank branch. There's a definition of bank branches that APRA has to enforce, and they're not doing it. The banks are hiding their shutdown of branches by doing this way. So if there's if it's called a tellerless bank or a cashless bank or a bank where you can go into your banking, but when it comes to handing over cash, they say you've got to use the ATM, that is not a bank branch. We want everybody who knows of the existence of these things, contact the Citizens Party on info@citizensparty.org.au or our toll-free number, 1-800-636-432. Tell us what the address is and what bank it is, right? So that we can compile this list, because we're going to be raising this in Parliament. It's all part of holding the government to account, the public holding the government to account, which we spearhead a lot, but also building the case for a postal bank, because a postal bank will make sure that we do proper full banking services in every community.
Yep, so please contact us about that. Now on to our second topic, taxpayer-funded warmongers hide from scrutiny. And you're in the middle of this story, Robbie, but just to preface it, last week on the show you reported at length on the press conference held by the Chinese ambassador, and the reaction to that with the press pack absolutely piling on, and there have been a number of key former diplomats who built the Australia-China relationship that have shown their deep concern about what went on there. Stephen Fitzgerald, who was our first ambassador, said that you can speculate they'd already pre-written the headlines, and we've since had ex-diplomat to China and Hong Kong, Jocelyn Che, who came out saying it was apparent they had come up with prepared questions and were trying to engineer a quote for a headline news item.
And the bottom line of all that is what the media did that day is show that they have an agenda, which is if there's any chance to reset Australia's relationship with China, to take the heat out of it, they're there to stop that.
And of course, we're warning against the danger of war, potentially world war. You've had warnings of even nuclear war from the UN's head Guterres. You had this week Swiss finance minister and former defence minister Uli Maurer saying it can't be ruled out that in a few weeks there will be a nuclear war in Europe. I'll put up a headline, Britain should prepare for a nuclear war. Last week on the show we played Scott Ritter warning, Americans will die in this, which brings me to the interview you did with John Lander, who wanted to discuss that point, because for Australia the threat is quite different. He made very clear in his interview, which you can watch on our YouTube channel, it should be the item below this one if you're watching it on YouTube, that the US has no intention to go to war with China. They know what that would mean, as Scott Ritter pointed out, as others have warned, with the threat of global thermonuclear war. What they will do is keep their distance by having a proxy war where Taiwan and Australia will be on the front lines, and the intention is to use such a proxy war to weaken China, just like they're trying to weaken Russia.
And I said to John, we'd talk out the way our politicians are acting, they're talking us into being this proxy role. And John said they're not just talking us, they are moving in that direction. That's what interoperability and interchangeability with our military actually means. So they will, the Americans will happily keep arming us while we're, bearing our chest and running into the machine guns equivalent of what we did at Gallipoli, right? Just sacrificing ourselves for an imperial agenda. Because unfortunately Australians can be induced into thinking that way, and the Americans say, we've got your back, mate, but they will make sure they're out of the firing line. The Chinese will never attack them because China doesn't want a nuclear war. China doesn't want any war, but it has a red line, and it's going to stick with that red line on Taiwan. And this is, John's warning is really, really stark, and I can't emphasise how much of an expert he is. He's the clearest strategic thinker in Australia today. You've got to watch that interview and share it and send that to your local politician.
Absolutely, because our politicians, we all know, anyone that's met with a politician knows they don't have time to even read the legislation they're voting on, let alone do research on such a matter of consequence. So where are they getting their advice from? The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is one of the key outfits, and that's what we want to talk about today, because they've been out muddying the waters, in particular on the Xinjiang question, the question of supposed, or what they claim to be forced labour happening in China. And this is ahead of a report that's due to come out, I think, at the end of the month, by Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile and current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who made a trip there in May. And it's the first time in 17 years the UN Human Rights Commission has been there in China to check out these claims. And we'll just play a little bit of what she said, and then I'll let you comment on that.
I encourage the government to undertake a review of all counterterrorism and de-radicalization policies to ensure they fully comply with international human rights standards, and in particular that they are not applied in an arbitrary and discriminatory way.
All right, now that's an innocuous statement, but this is what she's talking about. But she described what's happening in Xinjiang in terms of counterterrorism and de-radicalisation. And she said, I caution the Chinese government, you make sure that you follow the rules when it comes to these things. So this week, I and Richard Barden, who was my co-host last week, went along to an event at La Trobe University, La Trobe Asia, in the CBD of Melbourne here, because they had a panel of people from Human Rights Watch, which is an American-funded fake human rights organisation, and a La Trobe University professor, and a person who formerly worked at ASPI, Vicky Hsu, who is a co-author of a report that ASPI wrote in 2020 called Uyghurs for Sale. And we went along there because I wanted to ask questions about that report. That report came out in the middle of the pandemic. There hasn't been public fora to have engagement on this, right? So this was the first real opportunity that one of the co-authors of the report could be questioned. And I've got to give a little bit of background to that. But before we get on to Vicky Hsu, the Human Rights Watch representative on that panel attacked Michelle Bachelet for the words that the viewers just saw her say. And she attacked her because by calling it counter-terrorism, Michelle Bachelet was accepting that China is responding to a terrorism problem. And the American and British funded human rights mafia, who are using human rights to attack China and demonise it as the most evil country in the world, as per the prescription in a notorious memo that the State Department wrote for Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State in 2017, because he was a business guy that Trump appointed Secretary of State. And so the department wrote a memo for him on human rights and said, human rights is something we use against our adversaries, never against our allies. Right? So they don't care about human rights at all. And that Human Rights Watch representative was attacking Michelle Bachelet for acknowledging that China was trying to solve a terrorism problem. And you have no idea how bad that terrorism problem was. We've done shows in this program. But just to suffice, in roughly the same period as France suffered its horrific wave of ISIS-related terrorism, China suffered a worse wave of terrorism. So in that same period, we were putting the French colours up on the Opera House every few months, right? China, in the space of a decade, had 800 people killed in terrorist attacks by this ISIS-related organisation called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement or the Turkestan Islamic Party. And the human rights mafia want to pretend that never happened and it's not an issue. And I want you to think about that, because if just say you don't, you're the viewer and you think, the Citizens Party is talking about China again. Don't they know how bad China is? You must at least agree that if we cannot, when we're dealing with a country like China, acknowledge even basic facts that relate to their humanity and natural reactions to things, that they've suffered an awful wave of terrorism, they've got to do something.
Well, look at what the US did after 9/11.
They set up Guantanamo Bay, right? They invaded 2 countries, killed a bunch of people.
Surveillance state
mass
set
surveillance,
up.
Yep. What is it called? The
Homeland. Or whatever. What
was it?
I don't know.
Homeland Security, right? Department of Homeland Security. Thanks, producer. That's what we did. This was a serious problem China had to solve, right? And this Human Rights Watch mafia just doesn't want to acknowledge that at all. That, I can tell you now, is evil, because that will make sure you always end in war. If you cannot talk to the person on the other side of the table for you
and empathise
and have any sense of what their motivations are, then that's a recipe for disaster. So I wanted to say that, but now we're going to play another video of what actually happened on the evening, because what happened was not the intention. So Richard and I went along to ask Vicky Hsu some questions about her report. The reason it's filmed is because the question you see me ask is specific, and I wanted her answer to that, because I wanted to see if she's prepared to take credit for the consequences of the report that she wrote, because that could have legal implications if she was prepared to do that, right? But first, there's a little bit of background to this. I had met Vicky Hsu before under somewhat strange circumstances. It was last year. I was flying back from Canberra, and she was on my plane with me. And I recognised her. At the time, she had this shaved head, etc., and she was coming down to be on Q&A. And I knew her because I knew she'd written this report, and I knew her from ASPI, and I knew her because Four Corners had done stories on her. This is a woman who was a comedian, a Chinese-Australian comedian, right? Gets up there on stage and is as sassy as anything like comedians are, exhibits no sense of being a shrinking violet, right? She seems as game as anybody. She does there's a whole story that you can watch her on Four Corners on that. But then she gets this job with ASPI, as an author of a report like this, which has had consequences. Uyghurs have lost their jobs because of this ASPI report, right? That's what we wanted her to acknowledge and take credit for if she chose to. So when I was on the plane, I'm thinking, when I see someone in the airport I recognise, I like to go and take an opportunity to introduce myself. In this particular case, we're allowed to swear on this show, aren't we? Ben, I had a Twitter altercation with her a year earlier, where I had taken exception to something that she'd said, and I sort of I pointed out that the language she chose to use on a personal issue, which was she was complaining about her ex-boyfriend not returning her stuff, and she used extreme language, and I said, this is the kind of language they use for Xinjiang. I mean, they're kind of making light of these claims that they're making, aren't they? And she replied to me, so that's a paraphrase of what I said on Twitter, and she replied to me, do a course in humour, you stupid old bald or fat bald. Right, so sorry about the language, that can be beeped out. So because of that altercation, I thought, I would like to introduce myself, so she meets me. But then, you're concerned about what that might mean, right? I didn't want to be, I did not want in any way to be seen to be someone who's confrontational at all, right? And I don't operate that way. I'm confrontational on this show, but I'm not going to be there's no overtones of anything, and I'm very careful about that. So I had texted someone saying, I mentioned Vicky Shu, who also knew of Vicky Shu. I said, she's on the plane, should I say something? And he said, no. This person advised me, a Chinese person actually advised me, no, she'll turn it into something against you. Anyway, so when we got off the plane, you're leaving the plane, you get off at your own speed, and I gave up on the idea. I wasn't going to talk to her. However, I then lined up for a cab, and at the Melbourne airport, it was the middle of the day, I was the only person lined up for the cab. And you've got to wait, once you line up, then they call the cabs down, and I'm waiting, and this other person comes and stands next to me, literally right next to me, and who is it? It's Vicky Shu. And we're both waiting there quietly for a cab. And I thought, well, I am going to say something. So I said to her, hi, I'm Robert Barwick. Do you remember me? You called me a stupid old... And I'm not standing... I'm standing 3 metres away, right? You called me that. And she goes, oh. And I said, look, I'm sorry for what has been happening to you, because she claimed that she's been trolled on social media, etc. And I didn't want her no one should be persecuted. So I said, I'm sorry for what's happened to you. I said, but do you understand why people like me do what we do? We don't want war with China. And she said, I'm already at war with China. I said, no, a real war with China.
Shooting war.
Yeah, that's what I meant. And she said, I'm in a real war with China. And I realised, I said, okay, well, good luck tonight on Q&A. Right, and our cabs had come by that time and left. That's what happened. That was my altercation with her last year, right? Just that. I tweeted about it at the time and said this dialogue about war with China, right? Because I said, I finished that tweet saying ASPI has a lot to answer for, in my humble opinion, i.e. that they've got someone like Vicky Shu in this frame of mind that she thinks she's at war with China, and that's all it was. So then, this time though, I went along to a public meeting, knowing she was there, not having anything in my mind about that event, because she wrote a report that's had consequences and I wanted to ask her a question. So we'll run the tape. This goes for 2.5 minutes so people can see what happened.
On the Citizen Party, I got 2 questions for Vicky. The first is on the effectiveness of your Uyghurs for Sale report. Can you identify manufacturing companies that have stopped using Uyghur labour because of your report?
Maybe the speaker goes up to work.
First of all, I would like to point out that last year during one of my trips to Melbourne to record Q&A, I ran into Robert at the airport, and in my opinion, I was ambushed, and he misrepresented our exchange on Twitter, and he accused me of wanting war with China. So I do not consider Robert to be here in good faith, and I refuse to answer his questions.
Oh, give me a break. I did not read the tweet. Excuse me. Read the tweet. I did not accuse you of that. I reported. I said I don't want war with China. I just quoted you saying I'm at war with China. I did not quote you saying anything else. You can see the tweet online.
Anyway, let's. You asked
No.
question.
I asked a question. I'd like an answer. Instead, I got attacked.
Sorry, responded. Please
This is
sit down or
censorship.
leave.
You speak.
It is censorship. For those who are interested, I've brought along 10 copies of Jacqueline James' legal analysis of the Uyghurs for Sale report, and if you're interested, she debunks it completely and thoroughly.
You're an apologist for genocide. Get out.
And you're censoring.
I am not an apologist for genocide. This is a joke. Raising the living standards of people is not...
Sit down.
Excuse me?
Sit down.
No, I'm not going to sit down. I've been attacked.
Excuse me.
Anyway, you said please either sit down or we have to leave the room.
You had your moment, and Jack had her moment on Monday in Canberra, and he's been heard, and we'd like to ask you to
Well,
leave, please.
I'd like... No, we'd like a response. You
Target
are
or-
troublemaking in international affairs.
I'll point out that
Everything-
Robert, you have potentially stalked me before, and
Excuse...
I'd like to ask you to leave, please.
For
We're
the,
here for a discussion.
for the record, I was at the taxi rank next to Vicky at Melbourne Airport. I didn't stalk her, I didn't follow her, I recognised her and I asked her a question.
and I'm running to you again here today with 10
I have
copies.
come to ask you this question, Vicky.
We have other questions.
That's not stalking, this is a public event.
And I refuse to answer your questions because I do not consider them to be a good faith.
Please leave.
And I do not
Would-
enjoy...
Before I leave, would anyone like a copy of this report?
Please leave the room.
Apologies, I would like a copy of this report.
We read it. It's nonsense.
We'll pick it up when we wanted.
Don't be a drama queen.
Oh, don't be a drama queen. There's... So, I just want to make 2 points about that, what people just said. I did not go along to be disruptive like that. That became a massive disruption. That was not the intention. I've disrupted meetings before, as you know, right? There's been times in our political career when you go, okay, I'm going to go and disrupt a certain meeting. That was not that. I wanted
The answer on record.
The answer on record. That's why it was being filmed. Thank God it was being filmed, because it became that. And it became that because by attacking me like she did, I felt I had to answer to defend my... Here's me, a large, bald guy in an overcoat at the back of the room, and this young Chinese lady is saying, you know, he ambushed me, he stalked me, and I knew the truth of it, so I felt I had to answer that, and it became more of a disruption. But the bottom line was, I had done nothing. I had done nothing on that night to give her an excuse not to answer the question. She did not want to answer that question. And there was only one person in that whole room, the man yelling, "This is censorship," who was not part of an echo chamber, there to just accept Aspie's claims without question and not push back. And every time you try and deal with these people, Lisa, they block you. You know, if they make claims on Twitter, you respond to them, they instantly block you, right? And they do not want public engagement. And the woman I cited, Jacqueline James, who wrote the report debunking that, she had gone to Aspie in Canberra on the Monday night, 2 nights earlier, to ask the same question and had a similar response from the panel. In fact, we might be able to play a little clip of that as well, because there is some video. You can hear Jack talking.
Hey Yacho, I just want to refer to your statement on Twitter on the 27th of January. Human rights in China is already so bad that it warrants our uttermost outrage over the CCP anyway. There is really no need to exaggerate. Inaccuracy ultimately damages the cause. Now, I just want to say I agree with that. I agree that we shouldn't exaggerate, and I agree that we shouldn't damage the human rights cause through inaccuracy. Now, as a private citizen, I've done a legal analysis, an objective legal analysis of the Aspie Uyghurs for Sales report. Measured against law and evidence, I've found all sorts of horrible problems with it. There's falsehoods, there's exaggerations, there's misrepresentations. But the most controversial one, the most stark one, is this high school is represented as a concentration camp in Xinjiang, siphoning off forced Uyghur labor. I've got photos of girls, of graduates, who are clearly going off to work as consensual workers. Now you are sitting right next to the man who can change the report and make one part of it accurate, to remove that high school and stop pretending that it is a concentration camp in Xinjiang. What are you going to do about it?
Sorry, before you do that, as per the agreements, would you mind identifying yourself?
I said Jack Jane.
Oh, sorry, didn't hear that. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think, you can disagree with SP report, you can disagree with human rights reports, but they're the victims who are speaking up,
I'm speaking of victims too. Consensual workers have the
Jack,
right to work.
Yacho gave you the courtesy of listening to your entire question. Let's allow her to respond.
It's the people who fled the camps who are speaking up. It's the people whose father and mother who are in the camp speaking up. It's the people whose cousins, sisters, brothers, they haven't heard for 5 years speaking up. It's the parents whose children in those boarding schools they haven't seen for 5 years, have no idea where they are speaking up. People are identify their children in propaganda videos.
I asked you a question about this report. Why don't you answer the question?
Jack, allow Yacho to finish her.
I don't want to hear your answer if you're not going to actually answer my question. I'm not giving
Well, then
you another platform.
as the moderator, I'll move on. But I will say that what you said at the beginning is important, that everyone needs to be held accountable, and ASPI needs to be held accountable as well. So whether it be citizens like you, Jack, or others, very, very happy to take concerns, areas of disagreement and difference. We need to be held accountable just as we hold governments and businesses to account as well.
This is a story that I collected from a reference in the Uyghurs for Sale report, but the story was excluded from the ASPI report. Thank you very much. It's a story of a Xinjiang Muslim child bride called Misbah al-Guri. She was pulled out of school by her parents and married off at the age of 15 to a 55-year-old wild imam to become his seventh wife. The husband would punch and kick her, not let her go to hospital because it was not halal, force her to cover her face and indoctrinate her with extremist ideas, which included viewing women as appendages of men. Whereas Human Rights Watch and whereas ASPI to protect this woman's human rights, social rights, economic rights, all of her rights. Where are you? I'm hearing silence.
Can I just take that one, since I personally worked on that report? The thing with Xinjiang is that what that source is probably a government-backed state media outlet. And what they have been doing for decades now is just kind of hyping up these stories about Muslims in the region being backwards and mistreating women. And I'm not saying this is fake. Don't put words in my mouth, please.
Jack, again, Daria gave you the very, very strong courtesy of allowing you to ask the question. I've actually extended time to allow you to ask the question. Allow her to answer. And we can talk about it offline as well.
So it is difficult to verify. If you can verify that claim, I would be very happy to read it. But, it is not what we were reporting on at the time. Plus, it was not verifiable, so we did not include it in our report. When you come back with something that is verifiable, we will more than happily, check it. And we have rectified our report before. We're not scared of doing so. We're not scared of letting you talk right now.
And she got pretty much the same. They just were not interested in engaging at all. And that's what you're dealing with.
And these guys are clearly not used to being accountable.
No.
Even though they get funding from the Defence Department, they're not the ones on the chair in Senate estimates.
No.
To answer to these kind of questions
that
are determining our policy.
Exactly. They are unaccountable. They're funded by the taxpayer. They have put out more diatribe. This organisation, ASPI, is quoted worldwide. Every time it says something about China, nationally coordinated headlines worldwide. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute says Chinese people eat babies, right? Oh yeah, it must be true. Let's do a tribunal on the Chinese people eating babies. That sort of garbage is what they produce, and it's not accountable. So only a few people are prepared to take them on. We do. Jacqueline James tried to, and you saw the consequences.
And look, just as a final comment, and you might have others, but our place to stand as a nation to claim China is some, autarkic, dictatorial power that's not a democracy. Our place to stand to claim that is growing increasingly thin. We're on this little ledge, if you like, after what we've just gone through with what Morrison did, which is part of a whole progression. So
100% agree. So I won't add to that. I'll just remind people what I said earlier about the postal bank and the cashless branches. Please let us know if you know a cashless branch.
And don't forget to contact us, because all the information is backed up in the alert service. You can get a free copy if you haven't already, or subscribe and support us. Contact us to find out more. That's the show for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa.
Thanks for tuning in, and see you next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.